All right, so today's story is called Henry's Freedom Box, and this is a book that I've always really liked. It's actually a true story, and it is set a long time ago. You're going to see in history, but it is a true story, and it has beautiful pictures. And it's one that I normally like to read to my students, but I didn't get a chance to this year, so I thought I would share it with all of you right now. All right, so Henry's Freedom Box. Here's Henry. Henry Brown wasn't sure how old he was. Henry was a slave, and slaves weren't allowed to know their birthdays. Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in a big house where the master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, but Henry's mother knew things could change. Do you see those leaves blowing in the wind? They are torn from the trees like slave children are torn from their families. One morning, the master called for Henry and his mother. They climbed the wide staircase. The master lay in the bed with only his head above the quilt. He was very ill. He beckoned them to come closer. Some slaves were freed by their owners, and Henry's heart beat fast. Maybe the master would set him free. But the master said, "You're a good worker, Henry. I'm giving you to my son. You must obey him and never tell a lie." Henry nodded, but he didn't say thank you. That would have been a lie. Later that day, Henry watched a bird soar high above the trees. Free bird, happy bird, Henry thought. Henry said goodbye to his family and he looked across the field. The leaves swirled in the wind. Henry worked in his new master's factory. He was good at his job. "Do not tear that tobacco leaf," the boss yelled at the new boy. He poked the boy with a stick. "If you make a mistake, the boss will beat you." Henry was lonely. One day he met Nancy, who was shopping for her mistress. They walked and talked and agreed to meet again. Henry felt like singing, but slaves didn't dare sing in the streets. Instead, he hummed all the way home. Months later, Henry asked Nancy to be his wife. When both their masters agreed, Henry and Nancy were married. Soon there was a little boy, and then another and another. Henry knew they were very lucky. They lived together even though they had different masters. But Nancy was worried. Her master had lost a great deal of money. "I am afraid he will sell our children," she said. Henry sat very still. Henry worked hard all morning. He tried to forget what Nancy had said. His friend James came into the factory. He whispered to Henry, "Your wife and children were just sold at the slave market." "No," cried Henry. Henry couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't work. "Twist that tobacco," the boss poked Henry. Henry twisted tobacco leaves. His heart twisted in his chest. At lunchtime, Henry rushed to the center of town. A large group of slaves were tied together. The owner shouted at them. Henry looked for his family. "Father, father!" Henry watched his children disappear down the road. Where was Nancy? He saw her the same moment she saw him. When he wiped his tears away, Nancy was gone too. Henry was no longer sang. He couldn't hum. He went to work, and at night he ate supper and went to bed. Henry tried to think of happy times, but all he could see were his carts carrying away everyone he loved. Henry knew he would never see his family again. Many weeks passed. One morning, Henry heard singing. A little blue bird flew out of the tree into the open sky, and Henry thought about it being free. But how? As he lifted a crate, he knew the answer. He asked James and Dr. Smith to help him. Dr. Smith was a white man who thought slavery was wrong. They met early the next day at an empty warehouse. Henry arrived with a box. "I will mail myself to a place where there are no slaves," he said. James stared at the box and then at Henry. "What if you cough or if someone hears you?" "I will cover my mouth and hope," Henry said. Dr. Smith wrote on the box, "To William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Henry would be delivered to a friend in Pennsylvania. Then he printed on the crate in big letters, "This side up, with care." Henry needed an excuse to stay home or the work boss would think he had run off, and James pointed to Henry's sore finger. But Henry knew it wasn't bad enough. He opened up a bottle of vitriol. "No!" cried James. Henry poured it on his hand. It burned his skin to the bone. Now the boss would have to let him stay home. Dr. Smith bandaged Henry's hand, and they arranged to meet the next morning at 4 o'clock. The sun was not yet up when Henry climbed into the box. "Ready?" he said. James nailed down the lid. Dr. Smith and James drove to the station. The railway clerk tipped the box over and nailed a paper to the bottom. Dr. Smith begged the clerk to be careful, but they didn't listen. They threw the box into the baggage car. Hours passed. Henry was lifted up and thrown again, upside down. He heard waves splashing. This must be a steamboat headed for Washington, D.C. The ship rode smoothly, but Henry was still upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His face grew hot. His eyes ached. He thought his head would burst, but he was afraid to move. Someone might hear him. "I'm tired of standing," said someone. "Why don't we move this box and sit on it?" said another. Henry held his breath. Could they be talking about his box? Henry was pushed. The box scraped the deck, and now he was on his right side, and now on his left, and suddenly right side up. "Why do you think this is here?" said the first man. "Mail, I guess," said the other. "I'm mail," thought Henry, but not the kind they imagined. Henry was carried off the steamboat and placed in a railway car, this time head up. He fell asleep on the rattling song of the train wheels. He awoke to a loud knocking. "Henry, are you all right in there?" "All right," he answered. The cover was pried open, and Henry stretched and stood up. 4 men were smiling at him. "Welcome to Philadelphia." At last they had a birthday. Henry had a birthday. March 30th, 1849, his first day of freedom. And from that day on, he also had a middle name. Everyone called him Henry Box Brown.